think we'll get started, folks. So you're here for the webinar and everything you need to know about transferring your UK pensions if you're moving to Australia and have a UK pension. I'm Stephen Ford. I'm head of the UK advice team here in the UK. I have with me Paul Lawson-Tyers, who's a financial advisor and an international pension transfer specialist. So we'll be sharing the content for the evening. And then at the end, we'll have Q&A. You'll see above you or somewhere on the screen in a tab, the Q&A button. If you have questions through the evening that you'd like to ask, can you please put them in that section, and then we'll pool them and answer them at the end. There is a chat function also, so if you get a bit lost and a bit stuck, then feel free to use the chat function. Just a quick caveat, I guess basically, as you are probably aware, pension rules can change through legislation in both Australia and the UK. So what we have here is what we know as of 1st of June 2021, but it can change. So we just have to make sure, and that's why it's important that you check back with us that as the world evolves and the rules change, that we need to reflect that and those types of conditions. You may be aware or not, it depends on your work experience and where you've worked, but there generally are a number of different types of UK pensions. The ones that can be transferred are the ones that you perhaps joined through working at a company in the UK. You might have begun a private pension because you have a limited company, or you wanted to start one for someone else, or you wanted to transfer out of a company pension and begin that. And the third kind, which is becoming less common in terms of new joiners, but what's called defined benefit schemes in the public sector. They are less common, and they're based on receiving an income for life and perhaps a spouse's pension, or 50% spouse's pension usually. So they're the three most common types, and you can transfer all of those. The one in particular, number 3, is the one that often can be a large opportunity because all the income that you would have received over your life is aggregated into one lump sum and becomes a transfer amount that then would move into a superannuation scheme in Australia. So it can be a very good way of getting a large pooled lump sum. And if that's invested wisely, then perhaps outperform the income that you would have got if you had stayed in the UK or just taken the income out of Australia. There are a series of pensions, though, that you can't transfer, and one of them is the UK state pension. You can take this pension in particular, but it's even if you do live in Australia, it's just not indexed with inflation if you're no longer living in the country. There's a number of government unfunded pensions, such as an NHS pension, army or military pensions. They also can't be transferred. Company pensions that are in what's called the Pension Protection Fund, which is where you end up if you're in a defined benefit fund and they didn't have enough money to fund your income for life, so they've had to be put in a protection fund. That can't be transferred out. You can't transfer if you've already put a company pension into payment, which means that you have started to draw down on it. You can take the tax-free money, but if you draw down on the rest of it, you are no longer able to transfer it. So it's important that if you're considering moving back to Australia, that you don't do that in advance of that, or that will negate the ability to do it. And then annuities purchased through a life insurance company. Annuities are, you're using a tranche of money to buy an ongoing income stream. If they've put into payment, they also can't be transferred. So if you are considering that, we need to know which kinds of pensions. All the ones that can't be transferred, you can still take your money. It's just going to mean that there's a different set of taxation opportunities. And you would have to take it out of the UK and run it through your income statement in Australia. As I mentioned, there's two types of company pensions. One's called a defined contribution pension. If you are Australian or have worked in Australia, it's more like a superannuation scheme where you make contributions out of your salary and the employer makes contributions as well. And that grows based on a fund investment environment, so it can go up and down. Defined benefit, as I mentioned, is based on your salary at retirement, or an average salary in the number of years you've been in the scheme. And that gives you an ongoing entitlement to a per annum income amount that you are able to take. You can often get a lump sum, tax-free lump sum, if you want to do that, but your ongoing income payments will be lower as a result. And that kind of type of pension is a lot more complicated than a defined contribution one to transfer. So it does take a lot more care, and naturally is a bit more involved in terms of fees. I guess, why would you want to bother transferring? One major reason eventually, particularly if your pension remains in the UK for a while, because you're unable to transfer it until you get to a age of 55. One is currency control. So if you do have or leave your pension in the UK, then your wealth may fluctuate quite considerably based on the exchange rate. And you can't really do a great deal to manage that. So you're going to get richer or poorer based on the exchange rate of the pound to the Australian dollar, even if your investments in the funds have grown quite significantly. So it's always best to try and marry up the fund that you're in and the currency that you're in with the currency that you're expending. So that's one of the primary reasons, is to get it into the currency in which you live. Estate planning is another one, particularly if it's a defined benefit pension. Usually in those pensions, there's a full entitlement to a set amount of income for the rest of that person's life. But once they pass away, then that often is a spouse's pension, which is typically about 50% of the original beneficiary's pension. Sometimes 66%, but usually it's not the whole lot. And then very little passes to the children. So if you have quite a significant fund in a DB scheme, it might get rolled up, might be say £15,000 per annum. That might end up being £400,000 as a transfer value. That can then remain in your estate and be passed on to your spouse, and then passed on to your children. It stays in the family. Defined benefit schemes basically die with the spouse, and there's no more money after that. Another one in the context of defined benefit schemes, they obviously owe you an income for life, but then they've got to have the money tucked away to be able to afford that. And so if they haven't done that a very good job of that, then they end up being what's called underfunded. And so they aren't able to be in a position to pay you that pension as they promised. And so they wind up in the hands of the Pension Protection Fund, which is the government's way of supporting, making sure what you're owed you will get. But if that's the risk, you don't want to be in that, because sometimes there's, depending on your age, etc., there's caps on how much you can get. And sometimes you can't get 100% of what you were owed, might only be 90%. So that's another reason to get out of it if those schemes aren't performing very well. I guess one key reason, and then this is a trade-off between security, where you know you've got that income for life. That's a big benefit to know that no matter how long you live, you will always have a set amount of money coming in. The flip side is if you do want to transfer, then you put it in an investment environment. But sometimes if that's done well and things work in your favor and it's invested wisely, then that pot can grow significantly over time. And you are then in control of that and can influence how that is invested. And therefore your overall wealth can benefit greatly. And if done well, then you should also be able to draw down on the income that you would have got from the defined benefit scheme in the first place. If it's a defined contribution scheme, then it's a like-for-like swap, but you still manage to maintain the fund benefit and the ability to influence that. But the main thing, if it's a defined contribution and for defined benefits, is now you're moving a pension that in the UK is partly taxable, so 75% of it's usually taxable, possibly 100% if you're just taking the defined benefit income. Whereas if you move it across and transfer it into the Australian superannuation system, then at that point you can pull it out eventually when you qualify for retirement, tax-free. So you never really ever have to pay tax again. That's a significant advantage, as you know, and that is one of the main reasons why people do take the opportunity to transfer. Consolidating your pensions, so I guess it's simplifying life, isn't it? So if you pull all your pensions together and they're all swept into your Australian superannuation scheme, you've got all your money in one spot, one set of advisor fees, less complication, easier to manage, easier to keep control of and track. Before you transfer, it is worth, particularly if you're still in the UK and you haven't moved yet, it's a really great opportunity to try to maximise your UK pension contributions. Because the taxation is different in each country. In the UK, they give you tax relief on the contributions you make, and they don't tax the growth of the fund. It's a great chance to put extra money in before you leave to get the tax benefit. And that's at least 20% if you're a basic rate taxpayer. If you're a higher rate taxpayer in the 40 or 45% tax bracket, then fundamentally you're keeping nearly half of the money that you would have given to the HMRC, keeping it for yourself and then transferring that over to superannuation, where you can take it out tax-free and never give that tax back. So it's a significant advantage to shift your money across to Australia in this fashion. And you have that inbuilt advantage of the taxation. Over to you, Paul.
Right, so moving on to hi everyone, by the way. Moving on to why transferring may not be the best option for you. So obviously Stephen's gone through, some of the significant advantages of potentially moving your pension fund to Australia. But we do need to look very carefully at what you've got at the moment and what your objectives are and how it may affect you going forward. So, for example, it might not be as cost effective as you might want it to be moving it over, and there could be all sorts of reasons for that. For example, there could be an exit penalty on your defined contribution scheme personal pension type arrangement in the UK, and if you've got a transfer penalty on it, it may mean that it's not a good idea to transfer, at least right at the moment. Maybe in the future the transfer penalty might reduce, but that's one of the things that we need to look at. And we also need to look at whether there might be any guarantees built into your pension as well that might not be worth giving up, i.e. that with the advantages of Australia, it still wouldn't beat what you could have got from the UK scheme. And we need to be very careful, particularly in terms of defined benefit schemes. Stephen just explained about how you have an annual pension in the scheme, and also that the employers need to have enough money to pay that annual pension to you for the rest of your life. Now, if you do transfer out of the scheme and you get some of the advantages of moving it out, being able to move it into Australian dollars, have investment control yourself, and be able to pass it over to your beneficiaries, the fact is you do have that investment control, but with that comes the investment responsibility as well, and your fund will fluctuate according to what's happening on the investment markets, and that will determine what you can get out of the scheme when you get to retirement. So what we need to be very careful about is, if you're moving out of that guaranteed environment, is it definitely going to be worth your while, or at least a very good chance that you are going to be financially better off by making the move? Now, it's nothing to get too scared about. With a lot of people, when they're moving to Australia, it is a good idea to move out of the defined benefit scheme, but we have to take each one on a case-by-case basis. For one thing, the transfer values that are offered from one scheme might be a lot better than for another. You might have different objectives. You might have a different mix of assets that you can rely on outside of that defined benefit scheme. So we need to be very careful about what we do as far as that's concerned. Next slide, please, Simon. Okay, so looking at the transfer options, one thing we haven't mentioned so far is that you cannot make a transfer of a pension to an Australian superannuation scheme until age 55. That is due to a change in rules that came in a few years ago. That means that you can no longer move the pension. That's an HMRC rule. But with some people, you might have quite a number of years before you reach that age, and it's about what happens with your funds in the meantime. And one of the things that we can look at is potentially taking over the management of that for you, and there can be good reasons that I'll take you through in a moment, and potentially using a self-invested personal pension, or SIPP, or your existing personal pension. It's just a case of looking at what we do with those funds. Next one. Okay, so taking you through what a SIPP is. most people are familiar with a personal pension. A self-invested personal pension essentially does what it says on the tin. It allows you to direct the investments a lot more. Now, you might not want to do that. You may want somebody like ourselves to be looking after that for you. But the point is with it that you have a wider range of investments. You can put all sorts of different things into a SIPP that you wouldn't necessarily have available to you within a personal pension. Now, similar sort of products exist in Australia, self-managed super funds, and they work in a very similar way over there, and they can be a good solution actually for some of our clients once they've moved over there, particularly when we take into account some of the rules that I'll take you through in a moment about qualifying recognised overseas pension schemes. So just moving on to why I say a SIPP may be a good option for you. Stephen mentioned earlier about having your funds in Australian dollars in due course, being able to draw from an Australian dollar denominated fund, take that risk off the table of the currency moving around during your retirement. But of course, between now and your retirement, the currency is also going to move around, and there may be good opportunities to move into Australian dollars, and that may occur before age 55, or it may be that you just want to take that risk off the table. You want to know what you've got in Australian dollars terms to help you to budget for the future. We can invest in both GBP, sterling, and Australian dollars within the UK fund, and you can have a mix. You could have 50% in sterling, 50% in Australian dollars. It just allows you a lot more flexibility than you might have in your current schemes. And 100% of a defined contribution scheme, so which a SIPP is, because it has a fund value. 100% is available to your beneficiaries tax-free up until the age of 75. Within a defined benefit scheme, you'll have the spouse's pension that Stephen mentioned earlier. So and you can have as much input as you like in that investment, in the investment choices within that scheme as well. Most of the time people tend to want somebody to manage it for them, but there are the options to direct the investments yourself within that as well. So looking at those who are already age 55 when they move or eventually reach age 55, we can making the transfer over to an Australian superannuation fund. But the Australian superannuation fund must have QROP status, Qualifying Recognised Overseas Pension Scheme. And that is an HMRC term that it basically applies to an overseas scheme that then says to HMRC, we want to accept UK funds. If they do, they have to adhere to certain rules. But the main thing is it allows you to be able to move a UK pension fund abroad, in this case to Australia. And it says there within the non-concessional contribution limits as well, there is a limit on how much you can transfer into an Australian superannuation fund each year, which at present is $100,000 a year. Although you can roll up 2 years to make a $300,000 contribution, you just wouldn't be able to make a transfer in the following year or the year after because you've used those 2 years already. But it allows you to get a bigger chunk over there in one go if you want to. Now, for those people with large funds in the UK, clearly that means that we're going to have to drip feed the funds over to Australia over a number of different years. So we have to come up with a decent strategy to help to achieve that while also achieving your objectives at the same time. You could leave the pension fund in the UK and draw on it in retirement from the UK. But if you do, the Australians would tax that income just like the UK would. So you don't have that tax-free advantage that you would have if you were drawing from an Australian superannuation fund. So just moving on to, I've already mentioned about QROPs, just taking you through exactly what I mean by QROPs. Now, up until 2006, it actually wasn't very easy to move a pension abroad. There were limited circumstances, like for example, that you could potentially move it to your employer's scheme overseas, but again, you had to meet lots of different conditions. In 2006, HMRC, the government, brought in legislation that allowed you to transfer funds abroad to a qualifying recognised overseas pension scheme, which again is not a product in itself. It's just a set of rules that allows an overseas pension to apply to HMRC to say that they want to accept funds from a UK scheme. Now that overseas fund must then agree to certain reporting requirements back to HMRC. They have to report on various different things that happen, and also you can't take benefits in a different way from an overseas scheme to the way that you would be able to take benefits from a UK scheme. And that was a problem with Australian schemes that allowed you to take benefits earlier than age 55 in circumstances other than serious ill health. So you have serious ill health in the UK, but over in Australia there were other ways that you could take benefits early. HMRC eventually, when they did a review of QROPs, they decided that they didn't like that very much, and that's when it became impossible to make a transfer to Australia unless you were already age 55 when you made the transfer. It's a good option. It only really works as far as making a transfer overseas is concerned if you are definitely going to stay there, or at least have a good idea that that's what you intend to do at the time. If things don't work out in the future, it's not a disaster. We have ways that we can go about sorting that out. But the main thing is really that you have that intention to stay abroad when we look at making a transfer overseas, because it may not work to your advantage otherwise. So I already mentioned earlier that HMRC had a bit of a look at the rules and decided to stop transfers to Australia under the age of 55. Now that came about in 2015. It was as part of a big shake-up to UK pensions. You may have seen about the pension freedoms in the UK, more flexibility in the way that you can draw benefits from a UK pension scheme. So at that time, you were allowed, and now you're allowed to take up to 100% of your fund out of a UK pension fund. It doesn't always suit people because they pay a large amount of tax, but there's certainly a lot more flexibility now than there was. But as part of that, HMRC had a good look at various other things to do with pension transfers in general. And unfortunately, this is where I'm going to hit a few of you with a bit of a curveball. As part of that, HMRC decided that they no longer wanted you to transfer out of certain government-backed pension schemes. Now, there's 6 what they call unfunded public sector schemes, and they are the NHS, the police, the armed forces, teachers pension scheme, firefighters scheme, and the civil service pension scheme. If you're in any of those, I'm afraid that a transfer is just not possible. It's not even possible to a personal pension in the UK, let alone to a QROPS. You cannot transfer out of that type of scheme. You'd still get the benefits at retirement, but you'd be drawing on them from the UK, so you'd have to consider your tax position and also the currency fluctuations on that income. But yeah, it's not possible, unfortunately, to transfer out of those schemes. Now, for those of you that might be in the local government pension scheme, you might have mentioned that I didn't put that one in the list. It's because it's not classed as an unfunded public sector scheme. It's classed as a funded one. They have ring-fenced funds for that pension fund, so you can still make a transfer out of that. You can still apply for a transfer value, and we can still help you with that pension scheme if you're moving. Another major change to the rules was in 2017, where you can only transfer to a country in which you're going to live, or if both you and your pension scheme are both in the EEA, then you can have them in different countries. But much as Australia has now joined the Eurovision Song Contest, it doesn't actually form part part of the EEA at the moment. It's not included. But if you're actually moving to Australia, you're transferring your pension to Australia, it's not a problem. If you were looking to move to Australia and transfer your pension for whatever reason to somewhere like New Zealand, you'd have an issue. You'd lose 25% of your fund in tax. So we need to be careful about what we do as far as that's concerned. Another thing that happened in 2017 was in Australia that cap on how much you can transfer into a superannuation fund reduced to $100,000. I mentioned the 100,000 earlier. When I first started doing this job nearly 12 years ago, it was $180,000 per year. So you could roll up to make a contribution of 540,000. So, these things do change over time. And we may well see further changes in the future. Clearly, as you can see here, these are just a few pieces of legislation that have changed. Now, you notice that the Australian one was on the 1st of July. That's because that's the start of their tax year. Obviously, the UK runs 6th of April to the 5th of April. Over there, it's the 1st of July to the 30th of June. Next slide, please, Stephen. Okay, well, we've already covered a lot in this. We kind of got ahead of ourselves, really. If you transfer to Australia to a QROPS over there, it allows you to have the funds in the same country as you, denominated in Australian dollars, or you can still keep them in sterling over there if you really want to, if you're not ready to move into dollars. 100% of your fund will pass over to your beneficiaries. Now, I mentioned earlier that 100% of your fund does in the UK as well, but only until age 75. In Australia, it's for the whole of your life. It doesn't matter when you die, you will be able to pass 100% of your fund to your beneficiaries tax-free. Obviously, we've covered that you can have tax-free benefits in Australia as well. And also, particularly for those people that have already got Australian funds as well, as well as consolidating you might have quite a few pensions in the UK, that it's a good consolidation exercise anyway for those, but you may well then also be able to combine them with Australian funds in the future as well. So it can be of a real benefit, but as I said earlier, it needs to be very carefully considered. It won't suit everybody. Stephen, I think it's back to you. You're still on mute.
So unmuted, we didn't have any echo. Sorry, yes, these are the steps basically that would be undertaken if you wish to explore the transfer process. So it's pretty straightforward. First of all, there's a meeting, and that's no cost to you to explore it, get a general understanding of your situation, what your plans are, and so on, and what your assets are, what the opportunities are. Generally, at that point, we would be clear about whether we can help you and what to do. And at that point, you can then engage us either as an ongoing client to look after your pension until you're able to transfer it, or if you are able to transfer it pretty soon, along with the move to Australia, then we can also get ready for that to be undertaken. As a result of all that, you'll get a report. The report is basically recommending what to do. So how to, if you're investing your pension in the UK for a while, what to do with it, whether to exercise the opportunity to take AUD portfolios, etc. And then ultimately the transfer strategy that would perhaps suit your circumstances best. And then that basically is enacted, and we'll manage the funds for you, and then we'll manage the transfer for you. And of course, we have the BDH Australia division, BH Sterling Australia division, that can also then look after your funds at the other end. So as Paul talked about, got to transfer them into a certain type of fund, but they can also then look after those funds and make sure they're invested for you in the superannuation environment to your satisfaction. So that's broadly the process that would be undertaken. I guess just a caveat, and you will hopefully get a bit of an appreciation through the presentation, that there is a lot to be considered, and the taxation issues are quite sophisticated when it gets down to working it out. You don't feel that pain. We look after all that for you, basically. But really, you are having to make sure you get clear tax advice, and that's that's important. If you make mistakes, you either forfeit a lot of money or end up with penalties. And of course, you need to be able to be aware of whether you can actually transfer it. And of course, the whole thing, as Paul said, is a case-by-case basis where you need to weigh up what's in your best interests. And most of the time that is to transfer, but it's not always the case, or it's not always the case to transfer 100% of your pension. Just a little bit more about BDH Sterling. BDH Sterling actually grew out of pretty much helping people already in Australia transfer their British pension. So there's a significant heritage in that. As I mentioned, we have the Australian division, so they're licensed to do financial planning in Australia. We have the UK division, which is licensed here. So as a result of that, we can manage both sides of the equation for you. And of course, we're aware of the interplay between the two investment environments and also the taxation environments. We have what's called defined benefit transfer permissions. They're pretty rare these days. The FCA, who regulates us, don't really like people having their defined benefit pensions transferred. And so a lot of people, a lot of advisors have just dropped out of bothering. It's too complicated for them. And so as a result of that, we've become even more specialist in that sense, because we have the permissions and we are able to investigate transferring your defined benefit pensions to Australia. I mentioned we've got offices in both countries, so you get a one-stop shop in practice, and we can manage everything regardless of where you are at the, in terms of location any particular time, even if you're just visiting Australia. Of course, we have advice that we can give you in terms of what to do with your super when you get there. We have tax advice. We have a sister company in that environment, BDH Tax. They're also licensed to do taxation in UK and Australia. So they're the experts. Once it might get very, very technical, if there's a complication, we would refer you to them to get out those things sorted out. And then, of course, retirement planning. So if you're nearing retirement or in that phase of life and you're preparing for it, even a decade out, really, then we can make sure we understand with you how much money you're going to have, what your expenses are going to be, how much you need, how much you're going to draw down, what's the taxation implications, how best to make sure that's serving you in your retirement to meet your goals. As I spoke about before, BDH's heritage is off pretty much in the pension transfers areas. We've moved beyond that now into full financial planning, but that's where the company's main level of experience has emanated from. So if you'd like to have a chat about any of this, then I'll leave this up on the screen as we do the Q&A. But if you could just send an email to that email address, perhaps give us a little bit of an idea. Your age helps, because that helps us understand whether you're able to transfer yet. How far down the track are you? If you are beyond 55, then things can be done sooner rather than later, etc. So that helps. And then just some sense of what your plan is. Am I moving in a year, 2 years, 3 years, in 6 months, 2 months? And who is with me, and what am I planning to do when I get there? And what's broadly the money going to be used for, etc. So it just helps us give an orientation. We would speak to you anyway if we had a meeting with you and understand a lot of that, but just gives us a little bit of an idea to get us started. So I think we'll move into the questions. I will say one thing that Paul mentioned, the legislation page, and you can see that over a number of years things gradually shifted, and that may continue, but also some of the rules got relaxed. The Australian budget recently suggested in another 12 months' time, so long as the legislation passes, then some of the caps increase a little bit, and some of the constraints that were there before also released. So it's another reason to be, I guess, getting people like ourselves to help you, because we stay on top of that type of stuff, but also opens up more opportunities for people, particularly those in the late 60s. Okay, we'll get to the questions. I think one of the first ones, I'll take this one, Paul, and then maybe if you can see the second one. The first question is, can you please touch on the scenario of having a super fund in Australia and settling in the UK? Can you transfer the super fund to the UK, and what are the tax implications? The simple answer is the Aussies won't let you transfer a super fund to a pension, unlike the British. So really, you can't make that move. What you can do, though, is you can withdraw the money as a cash lump sum once you meet the release conditions. And release conditions means that you're basically over 60 and you're no longer working. You can be between jobs, or it's 65 if you are continuing to work. At that point, it doesn't matter whether you're still employed or not, you're able to take your super. So you can take it as a cash lump sum in Australia, which means no taxation there. And then it's a question of where was the superannuation money derived from. So if it came from employment work, then there's a lot of tax concessions that you can get up to 2017 that make it tax-free in the eyes of the HMRC. And then the growth beyond 2017 is taxed. If you transferred in a pension from the UK, when you go to pull it out, it's treated as a UK pension. So you revert to 25% as tax-free and the rest is income. So that becomes a little bit more complicated. And then if it was prior to certain legislation, then it needs a special set of consideration. So it's possible, and we're starting to do a lot more work in that field for a lot of people. And you can get a lot of it out pretty much with low tax rates, 5%, 3%, 2%. That's going to grow though, because 2017 is a stake in the ground, and the more that fund grows, the more of it will be taxed. Paul, the question for you, is there a time limit related to when I finish work in the UK and move to Australia, i.e. I read somewhere that I have to move to Oz within 6 months after finishing work in the UK. Is that correct?
This 6-month rule is something that I'm asked quite a lot, and it's generally misunderstood, or it's too much emphasis is placed on it, and it is, in my view, a little bit of a red herring. So, no, I mean, it's nothing to do with employment. The 6-month rule is to do with pensions and transferring your pensions over to Australia. So if you are already age 55 and you make a transfer over to an Australian scheme and you do it within the first 6 months, then there is no tax to pay on the transfer. But having said that, even if you transfer after 6 months, the only tax that you would pay on the transfer is on the growth between what your fund is worth when you enter Australia and what it's worth when you make the transfer. It won't be on the amount that you first had when you arrived over there. That is classed as a tax-free contribution to Australian super, and that's what is subject to the limit of $100,000 each year. The growth is taxed unless you do it within that first 6 months, but once the funds are in an Australian superannuation scheme, they are taxed as they go along over there until you go into the retirement phase, at which point they become tax-free. So this is one of the reasons why you end up with tax-free benefits at retirement in Australia, is because they don't give quite the same level of tax incentives up front that the UK government does. So the UK government gives you tax relief. You get the chance to invest that in a tax-free environment throughout your working life and hopefully get some decent growth off of it. But then they tax you at the other end. You're still better off, hopefully, as long as your investments have done well. In Australia, they don't really give you the same level of tax relief. Admittedly, that 15% that you might pay on the growth might be less than you pay if you had those investments outside of a superannuation fund, but it's not the same level of tax relief, which is why you get the tax free benefits at retirement. So really, you might transfer within 6 months to try and get out of the tax that you're then going to pay in Australia anyway. So do not wrap yourself up in that 6-month rule. It does not affect whether when you have to move, your employment or anything like that. It's all to do with pension transfers. It's something that we consider, but it's certainly not a driving force in what we do.
So a question for me and for you again, Paul. There doesn't seem to be many cure-ups super funds in Oz. Are there any commercial ones?
Yes, there's one. So up until 2015, I mentioned in 2015, this is when we had a problem with the age 55 rule. Up until then, you could transfer it to Australia at any age you liked. in 2015, as I said, the UK government had a good look at the Australian rules and said they didn't like them very much. So they imposed this 55 limit. Now, what happened was overnight, all of the schemes in Australia, all of the commercial schemes that had previously had cure-up status, had their cure-up status removed because they had members in their scheme that were under the age of 55. Now, what has happened since is that, yes, there are a lot of self-managed super funds on the list because they are set up by people that are already age 55. They're the only person in the scheme, or maybe it's a husband and wife or something, you know. But the point is, all the members in that scheme are already age 55 when they set it up, and therefore HMRC will grant them the cure-up status to accept the funds from the UK. There is one commercial fund now called the Australian Expat Superannuation Fund that was specifically set up post 2015 and will only accept you as a member if you are already age 55 when you join the scheme. So it's very much set up as a vehicle to accept UK funds. Now, once they got because they were a relatively unknown entity, if you like, well, once they got the cure-up status, we were very much expecting that all of the old, commercial super funds, big super funds over there, a bit like your Standard Lives or your Scottish Widows in the UK, we thought they'd all jump on the bandwagon and get their cure-up status set up a specific age 55 scheme, but that was a few years ago now, and we haven't seen any movement on the rest of it. So, it's as things stand at the moment, and as far as I can see for the foreseeable future, your choice is Australian Expat Superannuation Fund or Self-Managed Super Fund. But if you've got reasonable size funds, the Self-Managed Super Fund may well actually be more cost effective than the commercial ones anyway.
So another question from Timothy, and Timothy there maybe might have to reframe it slightly. What are the implications if you're already in pension mode in Australia and wish to transfer from the UK? I wonder whether pension mode, Paul, means superannuation is being used. What would be your answer, Paul? Yeah, that's not a problem. Yeah, that's not really a problem. It's all to do with your age over in Australia. And this is one of the things that Stephen alluded to a minute ago with the changes in legislation that were proposed for next year. So if you are under age 65, then the only restriction you have as far as moving pension funds to Australia is that $100,000 a year limit, but you can roll it up and make a $300,000 one using your next 2 years allowance. If you've got more than 300,000 in your fund, you'd have to wait 3 years until you can make another transfer. But you've got that opportunity up until age 65. From age 65, as things stand at the moment, you can make a transfer, but only 100,000. You can't do that roll up. Once you get to age 75, you can't make a transfer at all. You can't make a contribution post age 75 in Australia. But if you are that age, then or you reach that age and you've still got UK funds, we do have other options. So don't worry too much about that. We will still be able to look at helping you and potentially still get a tax efficient end result for you. Now, also, in addition to those ages, once you reach age 67 at the moment, you also have to pass a work test. Now, this may be where you get stuck if you're already in pension mode, i.e. you're already retired. You have to prove that you do 40 hours of paid work within a 30-day period at some point during the tax year in which you make the transfer. And you have to do that every year that you want to make a transfer. You have to satisfy this work test. So for some people, it's not a problem. They say, well, yeah, that's fine. Do 40 hours in a 30-day period at some point. Other people just don't want to do it at all, in which case, again, we need to look at other options for them. Now, what Stephen was talking about just now is that from the 1st of July next year, it has been proposed
in the recent Australian budget, that they will remove that work test, and they will also allow you to continue to use that 3-year roll-up to make a $300,000 contribution up until age 75. So basically it'd be the same rules for everybody up until age 75, at which point you can't make a transfer at all. But that is only proposed legislation, and I'm very cautious about that. As I mentioned earlier, I've been doing this for 12 years. I've seen the Australians propose a lot of legislation that has never gone through or has literally been withdrawn at the 11th hour. So we need to be careful. Once it's written into law, I'll get more excited about it. At the moment, we have to be very careful about that one.
Okay, another one for you, Paul. Is it possible to start transferring a UK DC pension or defined contribution pension to a cure ops in Australia before I actually move there, possibly by several years?
Well, the simple answer is yes, it's possible, but it's not necessarily a good idea. I mentioned earlier that in 2017, one of the rules that HMRC brought in was that you had to transfer a pension to a country in which you were living. Now, if you transfer to another country outside of the EEA while you're still a UK resident, i.e. transfer to Australia, you will be hit with that 25% overseas transfer charge. Now, if you move to Australia within 5 years after paying that charge, you can then reclaim it. But we don't know how easy it is to reclaim that. Or how quick it is to reclaim that, because we generally tell our clients not to do it. And so, it's not something we encourage. And also you have to consider that if you do pay that 25% charge, even if you know that you're going to be able to claim it back in the future, you have to consider that, say you make the transfer now, you move to Australia in 3 years, and then you claim it back from HMRC, and I don't know, maybe get it 6 months later or something. That'll be 3.5 years that you haven't had 25% of your fund, and it hasn't been invested. You haven't been getting any investment growth, any interest off of it. So you could be that could really be to your financial detriment. So yeah, generally we don't encourage it. And also the other main point as well is that you might transfer thinking I'm going to move to Australia in a few years, but what if for whatever reason your emigration gets delayed beyond 5 years, and then you never get the chance to get that 25% back? It's just not worth mucking around with, in my opinion.
I will say that if you are planning to go back and you have cash in other investments, you can actually make super contributions before you go, but they'd be from after-tax money, and that can be a sensible way of putting money into investments in Australia, because superannuation is a great investment option. So that's also another option. Another question, Paul. Oh, they keep flicking along. Sorry, hang on. Is there a limit to the amount you can transfer from a SIPP to an SMSF?
Okay, so I've mentioned the annual limits. Yes, there is actually, Edward. There is a maximum that you can contribute towards super funds. A bit like if you've experienced the lifetime allowance in the UK, which is a little over £1 million at the moment, that you can hold in your pension fund. Not that you can hold in your pension fund, but once you've crystallised, once you've put benefits into payment in the UK of more than £1 million, you would have a charge on the excess. In Australia, they also have a limit. At the moment, it's $1.6 million. It's due to increase to 1.7 million, but it's not for everybody. People will generally have a limit between 1.6 and 1.7. I must confess that I haven't got my head round quite yet who is going to apply to which rule as far as the 1.6 and 1.7 is concerned. Something that needs a bit further investigation. But the point is, there is a limit on how much you can have. But it's a bit more flexible in Australia because that's just the amount that you can put into retirement phase. But up until then, if you do go over that limit, you can manipulate it a little bit. Like for example, if you have that level of funds, but you have a spouse who doesn't have nearly that much in their pension, you could potentially withdraw some money from your super, pay it in as a contribution, subject to that $100,000 limit in their name, and thus reduce your fund and reduce the chance that you might have to pay tax in the future. But it's not as onerous, even if you do end up with some of your fund that's taxed. It's not generally as onerous as it is with the lifetime allowance in the UK.
I will say, to add to that, if you think that issue is a relevant question, please speak to us, because there's loads of other ways to massage the situation and rearrange the finances to not be a problem. We don't need to answer
definitely.
this one. I can do it in brief. One lady has just suggested, I'll just read the question out. I'm 67. I sold my private pension and bought a house in Australia. I'm waiting for contributory age parent visa. I have investments in the UK and also have cash from hopefully selling my house here, which might be the UK, I think. Is there someone I can talk to about the best way to go? The answer is yes, there is. So one of me or Paul, or just contact that inquiries thing. We are talking about pensions transfers here tonight, but we do look after your holistic finances and working out basically a full migration plan. So that is exactly the type of work that we can support you on in every sense. Next question, do you have to be working in Australia in order for the transfer to be treated as a contribution?
Okay, so this is where I'm going to get even more technical. There are two different types of contribution that you make into a superannuation fund in Australia. One is called a concessional contribution. One is called a non-concessional contribution. So when you make a transfer from a UK pension fund, it's classed as a non-concessional contribution, and it is subject to that $100,000 limit that I talked about and the other rules that we've talked about. If you are making a contribution from your employment earnings, so it comes off of your salary before it then goes into your superannuation fund, that is classed as a concessional contribution, and it's subject to a different limit. It's $25,000 per annum that you can pay in as a concessional contribution. And what happens with that is it comes off of your salary, it goes into the super fund, and it is taxed at 15% as it goes into the super fund. So it's not necessarily, if you're paying a higher level of tax on your employment earnings than that, then you do get some tax relief, because you would be taxed more if you received it as income. But it's nowhere near the level of tax relief that you get in the UK, which is what I was talking about earlier. But yes, so you have a concessional contribution that you make from your employment earnings. A non-concessional contribution, it includes a UK pension transfer, but it's essentially any other contribution that you make into your super fund from what the Australians deem as already taxed money. So something like somebody might sell a house in Australia and they have a bit of money and they want to put it into their super fund. They make that as a non-concessional contribution. It's deemed that tax has already been paid on it, and therefore it goes into the superannuation fund as a tax-free contribution. It's not subject to that tax like the concessional contribution. And this why, with your transfer from a UK pension fund, what you had when you first arrived in Australia goes into Australia tax-free using that non-concessional contribution. It's only any growth from when you arrive in Australia to when you make the transfer that is taxed as part of that transfer. I hope that answers the question anyway.
Ian just said so.
Oh, sorry, it doesn't. Sorry, Stephen, it doesn't really answer the question. Basically, for a non-concessional contribution, no, you don't have to be working.
No. Ian says, is an SMSF a good option? Well, it in other words, it sounds like a good option to park your money in super in Oz. Is that right, Paul?
It can be, yes. It certainly gives you a full range of investment opportunities. You can pick from any sort of investment funds, etc. In addition to that, the fees, if you've got a reasonable sized fund, the fees won't be too bad actually from a self-managed super fund, and may well actually work out to be the same or even potentially cheaper than you might get from the one retail scheme that's available over there at the moment. So yeah, it can be a very good option. If you've got, say, £50,000 in your pension fund in the UK and you're looking to transfer that, self-managed super fund might not be such a good option. Then it might prove to be a bit expensive. But if you've got, if you had £500,000 in your pension, then it could certainly be a very good option for you.
Mm-hmm. So I think Timothy earlier, who said he was in pension mode, just clarified that sounds like he's in the retirement account mode over 65. So hopefully, Timothy, we've clarified that you can still transfer your pension. Another question.
Well, he can, but he does need to do that work test once he reaches age 67. But basically, Timothy, if that is the case, speak with us. We have other options that are available, so it doesn't rule out the options to get a real tax efficient outcome for you. So yeah, just get in contact with us on the inquiries email, and we'll speak with you about how we might be able to help you.
Okay. Another long question. I'll read it out again. I'm 42, trying to maximise my UK pension now with a view to return back to Oz in the next few years. That might mean I could be taxed on the growth between the age of 45 when I leave and therefore 55 when I transfer to super, which could be significant. If I'm working in Australia at 55, then all of the growth would be taxed on top of the Oz tax rate, as I already have taxable income. Does that significantly reduce the tax advantage and the usual strategies, drip feeding the transfer across to Australia over to Oz over tax years and offset with negative gearing Oz for the transfers? I think the one thing I will say to that is I think there's confusion over how these things are taxed. So the superannuation or the UK fund won't be taxed while the money's still in the UK. It's just at the time you transfer, there's a backward calculation going, well, if you had been in superannuation, what would you have paid in terms of the 15% tax on the growth? And so they're kind of very separate. It sounds like you're interpreting as though it's going to have to run through your income statement and be taxed on top of your marginal tax rates, which is not
well, it could.
For you.
Yeah, it could. Yeah, it could be taxed at your marginal rate if you don't go about it the right way. We're very used to it only being taxed at 15% because of the way that we deal with the funds and the strategies that we put in place. But certainly, yeah, if you don't do it in the right way, the transfer, it could end up being that you have to declare it on your tax return. So it's very careful. You need to be very careful about doing things in the right way as far as the transfer is concerned.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. So, and I think that the issue really is that you can't transfer your UK pension anyway, but the trade-off is you're saving possibly 40 or 45% tax in the UK. If that's invested for 10 years, that's going to grow into a decent chunk of change as it stands anyway. I think would more than offset any 15% growth tax that might be coming. So I do the maths and we can support you in that, but I think I wouldn't be as concerned. I think it's a great opportunity to stick away a lot of money that would have gone to the HMRC that will ultimately come to you. It means that your retirement should be way more comfortable, which means during the 45 to 50 year period, you might be able to relax and just enjoy spending your money, not worrying about retirement. So it's all a series of juggling trade-offs. Are there any requirements to notify UK pension funds of becoming non-UK tax resident, where there will be a gap of 5 to 10 years before reaching 55 when I transfer? What do you say to that, Paul?
There's no particular requirement as such, but it's just good practice to obviously keep in contact with your pension fund and let them know where you're going to be. I mean, it's not going to affect the tax efficiency of your pension fund or anything like that, but obviously if they need to correspond with you, send you annual statements, etc., then they need to know where you are. But yeah, it's not a mandatory thing that you have to inform them. But in general, if you move house, you want to tell your pension providers and other providers that you've moved house. Basically, in this case, it's moving countries as well. But if you treat it like you're moving house, then you'd notify them, wouldn't you?
I think the only thing I would say in addition to that, because that answer's fine, I would say though that a lot of pensions in workplace pensions are often in what's called a lifestyle fund, where you nominate a retirement age. So let's say I nominated 60, the age of 60, then the funds automatically alter the asset allocation to be more conservative, because they believe as you approach your retirement, you want more of your funds to be there to enjoy in retirement. So I just said, I think one thing is that before you do leave, even if you work it out for yourself, or come and see us, but to make sure it's invested in a certain type of fund that's going to maximize your retirement benefits, and also works in concert with whatever other assets you've got in your portfolio. So it's worth making sure that you are invested wisely, and you're not just left it in some inertia fund that they're doing all the hard work on, but ultimately might undermine your returns. Looks like the last question for the evening, bit of a peculiar one, and I'm not actually sure of the answer on this one. I live in the Netherlands, and so I have a Netherlands pension in addition to my UK pension. Do you have a partner in the Netherlands that can provide advice in moving that pension to Australia? I don't, but we could probably track one down, and Paul, you may.
Yeah, I have to admit, Ian, I don't have anybody in the Netherlands. It's one of a few countries that I haven't dealt with so far. I've dealt with some weird and wonderful countries over the years, including places like Lebanon and Kenya and Iceland, places that I'll probably never deal with again. But Netherlands has just been one that has bypassed me. But it may well be that one of our colleagues might have somebody that they can pass your way, but I wouldn't guarantee it. But get in contact with us anyway, because you've mentioned that you have a UK pension as well. See what we can do with that, and we may well have a solution for Netherlands as well.
Yeah, a lot of partners we work with in other sectors of the finance industry are exposed to lots of other countries, so we can also just go through them and get any recommendations. So as Paul said,
yeah,
send through a request. Well, thanks, folks. That's been some very good questions. Hopefully you got some value out of that. Again, if you'd like to meet one of us, just send an inquiry in and we'll arrange to chat through. Or if you just want to email some basic questions, we'll be able to give you some guidance. So we appreciate your time and appreciate you supporting us by taking part in the webinar. And we'll hope you enjoy the evening and the sunny evening it is. And thank you, Paul. Take care.
Thank you.